foreign policy. Just look what happened to Zbigniew Brzezinski, right? Barack Obama got attacked a couple of weeks ago for having Brzezinski as an advisor. And what was the sin that Brzezinski had committed? Not that he'd given bad advice to Jimmy Carter. The sin he'd committed was that he had written a very brief article praising our original article in the London Review of Books. And think of the chilling effect that would have on, say, a 35 or 40-year-old person who wanted to have a career in the foreign policy business in the United States. All right, one final point before I turn this over to John. It is often said that the United States backs Israel because there is broad public support for Israel in the United States, and so the politicians are just doing what the people want. Groups like AIPAC are essentially irrelevant. This argument isn't persuasive for several reasons. It's true Americans do have a generally favorable image of Israel, but they do not think the United States should give it unconditional or one-sided support. A survey conducted for the Anti-Defamation League in 2005 found that 78% of Americans think the United States should favor neither side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Another survey reported by Americans for Peace Now found that 87% of Jewish Americans favor a two-state solution. And finally, a poll by the University of Maryland in 2003 found that over 70% of what they called politically active Americans supported cutting aid to Israel if it refused to settle the conflict. So while Americans do have a favorable image of Israel, they want it to exist and be secure, as John and I do, they're not insisting that the United States back it no matter what. But of course, that's pretty much what American policy is, and the reason is the political influence of the Israel lobby. All right, so that's what the lobby is and how it works. The question now is, what effect does this have on U.S. foreign policy? Is it good for the United States or Israel? And that's an easy question, so I'll leave it to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Adele, for moderating. Thank you, Steve, for hosting Steve and me, and thank you all for coming. Steve has defined the lobby and made the case that it has a powerful influence on U.S. Middle East policy. I'd like to take the analysis a step further and argue that its influence has been largely negative. In a nutshell, our argument is that the lobby, working with Israel itself, has pushed U.S. Middle East policy in ways that are not in the American national interest, and I might add, not in Israel's interest either. I will focus on two cases tonight. First, how U.S. support for Israel's policies against the Palestinians in the occupied territories has fueled our terrorism problem, and second, the run-up to the Iraq War and the influence that Israel and the lobby played in that set of events. There are three cases that we talk about in the book that I will not address in my formal presentation, but we can certainly talk about in the Q&A. That's U.S. policy toward Iran, U.S. policy towards Syria, and U.S. policy during the Lebanon War in the summer of 2006. Let me start with America's terrorism problem. The conventional wisdom among Israel's supporters is that Israel's treatment of the Palestinians has little to do with why the United States is so hated in the Arab and Islamic world, and more importantly, little to do with our terrorism problem. In fact, Israel is said to be a valuable ally in America's fight against terrorism. Indeed, it is said to be the most important ally by far in the Middle East. This received wisdom, however, is wrong. There is an abundance of survey data and anecdotal evidence that shows U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and U.S. support for Israel's efforts to colonize those territories angers, if not enrages, huge numbers of people in the Arab and Islamic world. The State Department, for example, set up an advisory group on public diplomacy in Arab and Islamic countries, which reported in 2006 that, quote, citizens in these countries are genuinely distressed at the plight of the Palestinians and at the role they perceive the United States to be playing. Not surprisingly, that anger helps fuel terrorism against the United States. Let me emphasize that I am not making the argument that our support for Israel's policy towards the Palestinians is the only cause of our terrorism problem. I am simply saying that it is a major cause. Specifically, it motivates some individuals to attack the United States. It serves as a powerful recruitment device for terrorist organizations, and it generates sympathy and support for terrorists among huge numbers of people in the Arab world. The hostility towards the United States generated by Israel's policies in the occupied territories has been recognized by American presidents since 1967, when Israel first conquered the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. This is why the official policy of every U.S. president since Lyndon Johnson has been to oppose settlement building in the occupied territories. But no president has been able to put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements. Indeed, as Steve pointed out, the U.S. has protected Israel from criticism at the United Nations and given Israel more foreign aid than any other country and given it unconditionally. Of course, the reason why no president can put meaningful pressure on Israel to stop building settlements, even though that's official American policy, is the lobby. A critically important issue when talking about America's terrorism problem is the matter of how U.S. support for Israel's brutal treatment of the Palestinians relates to what happened on September 11th. It is commonplace to hear Israel's supporters say that, number one, Osama bin Laden did not care much about the Palestinians until recently, and he only cares now because it is an effective recruiting device. Two, the events on 9/11 had nothing to do with Israel. And three, those involved in the attack on 9/11 hate us because of who we are, not because of our Middle East policies. These lines of argument are frequently purveyed by key figures in the lobby. For example, Robert Satloff from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy claims that bin Laden's identification with the Palestinians is, quote, a recent and almost surely opportunistic phenomenon. Alan Dershowitz maintains that, quote, prior to September 11th, Israel was barely on bin Laden's radar screen, end of quote. And Dennis Ross, who also works at the Washington Institute, says that bin Laden was merely, quote, trying to gain legitimacy by implying that this attack on America was about the plight of the Palestinians. These claims, however, are simply not true. It is clear from the historical record that bin Laden has been deeply concerned about the plight of the Palestinians since he was a young man. That concern was reflected in public statements of his throughout the 1990s, well before 9/11. Consider what Max Rodenbeck, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist magazine, wrote in a review of 2 books about bin Laden, one which was a compilation of his major speeches. I'm reading now from Rodenbeck's review. Of all the themes, the notion of payback for injustices suffered by the Palestinians is perhaps the most powerfully recurrent in bin Laden's speeches. Regarding the actual attack on 9/11, we now know from the work of the 9/11 Commission that U.S. support for Israel was a major cause of those attacks. It was not the only cause for sure, but it was a key cause. For example, the 9/11 Commission reports that bin Laden wanted to make sure that Congress was a target of the attackers because it is the most important source of support for Israel in the United States. The Commission also reports that bin Laden twice wanted to move up the date of the attack because of events involving Israel, even though doing so would have increased the risk of failure. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, consider what the 9/11 Commission report says about the motives of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who it describes as the principal architect of the attacks. To quote the Commission report, by his own account, KSM's animus towards the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. Again, that's from